Good morning and welcome to today's public panel convened by the Middle East Institute Syria program in order to mark the publication of a new book co-authored by Ambassador Itamar Rabinovich and Carmit Valensi, entitled Syrian Requiem, the Syrian Civil War and its Aftermath. The book, in its own words, analyzes the causes and course of a bitter conflict from its first spark in a peaceful Arab Spring protest to the tenuous victory of the Assad dictatorship, and traces how the fighting has reduced Syria to a crisis-ridden vassal state with no prospect of political reform, national reconciliation, or economic reconstruction. It's a really brilliant book that tells a powerful story of what has been a truly defining conflict of our age, and one that remains not just unresolved, but ongoing today, 10 years later. And yes, you did hear that right. In just a few weeks, we will reach an extraordinary milestone with the 10-year anniversary of the uprising on March the 15th. There really can be no underestimating the consequences of Syria's crisis. It's transformed the world in ways that no other conflict has done in decades. The unprecedented exodus of refugees towards Europe in 2015 arguably catalyzed an international surge in far-right populism that may have rippled all the way to the United States, emboldened Brexit, provoked disunity within the European Union, and challenged transatlantic ties like never before. Syria's neighbors, meanwhile, all American allies, continue to face the immeasurable strains imposed by refugee populations that have expressed no sign of returning willingly unless substantive political change is realized at home. The rise of ISIS gave way to a years-long wave of terror attacks, resulted in a further erosion of nation-state borders in the Middle East and Africa, exacerbated ethnic and sectarian tensions in multiple hotspots worldwide, mobilized the most expansive multinational military coalition in modern history, and created conditions in which NATO's second largest army, Turkey, is now more at odds with the alliance than in unity with it. The international norm against the use of chemical weapons was not just flouted on several occasions by Syria's regime, but nearly 340 times. Iran, meanwhile, found the time and space to expand its destabilizing behaviors further than ever before, and Russia has been granted the foothold it needs to begin challenging America's alliances and exploiting conflicts and vulnerable governments in Eastern Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and further afield. In Syria itself, the human cost of the war and the unrestrained brutality of Assad regime is palpably clear. Over 500,000 people have been killed, more than 100,000 others remain missing, and nearly 12.5 million people, over half the population, have fled their homes. Years of carpet bombing has left over 50% of the country's basic infrastructure destroyed or unusable, and there is no prospect for any meaningful reconstruction. Meanwhile, rife corruption, warlordism, mismanagement, and government incompetence have left the economy in tatters. More than 90% of Syrians now live under the poverty line, and inflation, exacerbated by financial crisis next door in Lebanon, has seen the Syrian pound crash to nearly 3,400 to a single US dollar today. Domestic economic strife is now giving way to tensions within the regime's elite and stimulating rising and arguably unprecedented levels of public discontent within communities that have stood by the regime throughout the war. Though the US-led coalition defeated ISIS's territorial caliphate in March 2019, the jihadist group is now resurging in areas controlled by the regime, where the group has increased operationally every month for 12 months consecutively. It appears now only a matter of time before ISIS attempts to take and hold territory again. It's a bleak, bleak picture, but one worth highlighting at a time when skepticism about why we should care is rising. To discuss their book, I'm delighted to welcome Ambassador Rabinovich and Carmit Valensi today. Ambassador Rabinovich is currently the president of the Israel Institute, the vice chairman of the Institute for National Security Studies, professor emeritus at Tel Aviv University, a distinguished professor at New York University, and a distinguished fellow at the Brookings Institution. Amongst a variety of former posts, he was the Israeli ambassador to the United States and Israel's chief negotiator during talks with Syria in the mid-1990s. Carmit Valensi is a research fellow at INSS, where she manages the Institute's Syria research program and edits the INSS's strategic assessment. And to join the panel today, I'm thrilled to welcome two equally formidable voices, Rime Allaf is a Damascus-born writer, a board member of the Day After Project, a member of Middle East Institute Syria Program's Advisory Council, and formerly an associate fellow at Chatham House. Beyond her renowned experience and expertise, Rime's involvement in today's event also closes a fascinating circle in a story of Syria's earlier history. Her father, Ambassador Muwaffaq Allaf, was Syria's chief negotiator and Ambassador Rabinovich's counterpart during talks in the 1990s. And alongside Rime is Ambassador Robert Ford, a senior fellow at MEI and formerly America's ambassador to Syria from 2011 to 2014, and previously Deputy Ambassador to Iraq and Ambassador to Algeria. In terms of format today, we will be kicking off with around 10 minutes of opening comments and remarks from Ambassador Rabinovich and Carmit Valensi, in which they'll outline some of the main findings and points from their book, and perhaps touch on what the future holds for Syria. We'll then turn over first to Rime and then to Robert for roughly 5 minutes each of responses, after which I'll moderate a brief discussion before moving to questions from the audience. On that note, let me please make clear that you can submit questions to me via Zoom's Q&A function, or if you're watching via our live stream, you can email your questions to events@mei.edu. So without further ado, let me please hand over to our authors of the day, Ambassador Rabinovich and Carmit Valensi.
Thank you very much, Charles. Pleasure to be here. You have already mentioned the connection between the Allaf family and myself. I'm delighted that Rime is here with us. I held her father in very high regard. In such negotiations, when two old enemies are trying to make peace, the heads of the delegation are both protagonists and partners. And I think we managed to walk the fine line, and I always had very high regard for his professionalism. I'm only sorry that the negotiation did not culminate in an agreement that I think would have spared all of us from the civil war in Syria had it materialized. Now, I'd like to say a word about our methodology. Oftentimes when one writes a history of such a complicated event, one tends to follow a narrative and then stop at given points and try to analyze major issues or the role of the major actors. We chose a different methodology. We do have a narrative. We tried to compress it as much as we could, but the core of the book are three analytical chapters which analyze the domestic, the regional, and the international actors, and are composed actually of a series of brief essays on each of them. This always risks a certain amount of repetition. We tried with the help of our editors to overcome that. A second point, we devoted some space in the chapter on the domestic scene in Syria to the culture war. We thought that many books and articles focus on military and political events. Culture is oftentimes left out. Culture is very important. Syria was, until the civil war, a very important Arab cultural center in literature, theater, television, and so forth. It now, unfortunately, is not. Many of the important Syrian intellectuals are out of the country, part of why we use the term Requiem for now. But during the civil war, at the height of the civil war, there was a conflict between the regime and the opposition, each side trying to show that the major names on the cultural intellectual scene are supporting their side and not the other side. That was a part of the book we were particularly delighted to work on. One brief comment on, you asked for findings. Of course, one central question is how come Assad survived the civil war? He did not win the civil war, but he survived the civil war. Obviously, he has been very resolute, unrestrained in his violence. And as we saw in the case of the Iranian regime and the opposition, if you are willing to crush at a very high price to your population, you can sometimes do that. Secondly, the opposition, unfortunately, has been very divided, reflecting the country's divisions. Syria is a very deeply divided country. But ultimately, one lesson is that if your friends are the United States and Western Europe, and if your enemies for the opposition are Syria, Russia, and Iran, and the regime was lucky to have the unquestioned support of Russia and Iran, their intervention decided the day. So let me stop here and pass the baton to Carmit to talk more about current and future.
Thank you. First of all, good morning. It's great to be here with you. And so thank you for hosting us today. You know, when we first began thinking about writing this book in 2017, it seems that the war was about to end with the victory of Bashar al-Assad. It started with the conquest of Aleppo province in December 2016, and later with the regime capturing all but the area of Idlib in northwest Syria. Obviously, the war is continuing as it is entering its 10th year, and Syria has been transformed almost beyond recognition. It is true that President Bashar al-Assad remains in power and perhaps has the upper hand militarily, thanks to his supporters, of course, but Syria is still far from functioning as a unified state. Assad fails to fully apply governance and control. He regained only 60% of Syria's territory and controls 12 million people out of a population of 17 million. Assad also had to compete with a large number of elements present in Syria who are basically contesting his sovereignty, including Turkey, opposition groups, US forces, Kurds, Shiite militias, and ISIS. Needless to say that he's entirely dependent on Iran and Russia. On top of that, the economic situation in Syria is deteriorating, largely stemming from years of war, but also the result of the deep economic crisis in Lebanon. And of course, the Syrian regime corruption and mismanagement. So the situation is that an estimated 90%, as you mentioned, Charles, of the Syrian population today live below the poverty line. We also see broader public criticism on the background of shortage of fuel and bread in Syria. And interestingly, there are some indications for lack of trust even among Assad supporters. What I want to say here is that the reduction in the military conflict in Syria has exposed the new face of the Syrian war in the form of a deep socioeconomic crisis, and also the dysfunction and ills of the Syrian state. Part of this, of course, is the physical damage of infrastructure resulted from the war. And, you know, experts have estimated that it will take the state 50 years to recover, and sums of money in the range of $250 to $300 billion. Unfortunately, it does not appear that there will be sufficient budgets or motivations for civilian reconstruction of Syria, at least in the near future. And, you know, ironically, Iran and Russia, which saved Assad from collapse during the war, lack the practical ability to save him from the Syria's economic crisis, or at least to significantly invest in the reconstruction process. US policy in Syria in general, and with regard to reconstruction in particular, of course, is yet to be determined under the new administration. But it seems that the US will not participate unless meaningful political reforms will be implemented. And I seriously doubt that the current regime would go along with that. So I will wrap up my remarks by saying that the title we chose, the Syrian Requiem for this book, reflects our belief that Syria of the years 1963 till 2011 is unlikely to be restored anytime soon. There is no prospect of political reform and national reconciliation or return of refugees. A large number of the population does not and probably will not accept Assad as a legitimate ruler. I also tend to think that there is no future to Syria under Bashar al-Assad. This regime, increasingly reliant on violence to remain in power, and continues in his oppression and atrocities, including arrests and disappearances, all of this in order to generate fear and deter the public from further social unrest. Unless the international community will act more assertively in the diplomatic, humanitarian, and economic aspects, I believe that we will see a worsening situation, a further economic and humanitarian crisis, That means more refugees, more extremism, and more regional instability. In other words, the conditions that caused the uprising 10 years ago will only get worse. So I'll end with this optimistic tone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador and Carmit. Thank you so much. Rime, over to you.
Thank you, Charles. I'd like to return the compliment to Ambassador Rabinovich. Thank you for the kind words you said about my father. I know that there was mutual respect, and I think he would be chuffed to see us here together today. I'd like to also say thank you to both you and Carmit for this great book. Highly recommended. It's comprehensive, it's engaging. And as a Syrian, I have to say that it's refreshing to see a book coming from Israeli experts or academics, which do not focus solely on the security issue, which we have seen in the past year. So I think it is a very welcome addition to people's understanding of Syria. In the end, we are talking mostly about governments and regimes dealing with one another, but sooner or later, the people also have to understand each other. I hope that, as Carmit said, the title and the word Requiem refer purely to the Assad regime and dynasty, because unlike a lot of people, I do think still that Syria is fixable and that we can save whatever is left after 10 years of devastation. I think one of the main problems that we have today is that we focus so much on important but side issues that we sometimes, miss the forest for the trees. It is important to talk about ISIS. It is important to talk about the Kurdish issue, the minorities, etc. But sometimes I think that Syrians feel that this is done purposely to avoid taking the bull by the horns. So if we leave aside the moral and ethical considerations about doing something about Syria, because quite frankly, that ship has sailed a long time ago, I think there's still a chance to reconsider our long-term strategies and our long-term visions. And when I say our, I mean this international community of which we tend to speak, which is not united with regards to Syria. There is a wish that we could just turn the page over and accept a so-called victory by the regime. But I think this is really short-sighted because the regime is not there by itself. Any audience which is familiar with the Syria conflict and the Syria situation knows that we are now under the throttle of Iranian imperialism, and that's what it must be called, which has spread slowly but surely and without any impediments from Iran to Iraq to Syria and Lebanon. It rules via a number of militias with terror from Lebanon to far beyond the east of Iran. And this is a consideration that will, I think, haunt us for years to come, even if we accept today the de facto victory of Assad and the fact that Russia is there. We still have cards to play. And one of those cards is the fact that Putin, President Putin, needs a way out. I think he is often described as this grand strategist. I tend to see him as an opportunist who has taken every chance he was given, not that he found, that he was given to take over the reins of control. I think also that it is a pity that the state of the Syrian opposition is where it is today, and you will not hear me often praise or defend members of the opposition, but as a whole, the opposition for years was also given an impossible task. And that impossible task was that it be united, that it take into account those different divisions in Syria, and that these be manufactured not organically, but there was a list of how many Kurds and how many Sunnis and how many etc. You all know the story. I think that in the long term, this has contributed, this has made Syria the self-fulfilling prophecy that they are divided, they cannot unite. Whereas had we begun with the core and the essence of the demands of the people, and we must speak about the demands of the people. It is not romantic to talk about this right now. The demands of the people were freedom and citizenship, and we have not tried this approach yet. Although Syrians have been given numerous trainings throughout the years. So I'll end this introductory comment by saying that I think it is very telling that Syrian public opinion, which manifests itself mostly on Facebook lately, is scathing about the Constitutional Committee because it understands that this is just a game to waste time. But after all these years, is watching with interest the idea that a military council could be formed. After 10 years of war, I think it is worthy of consideration. We need to pause and wonder, are we able to get them back together? Not necessarily through an armed attack on Assad, because obviously we do understand that this is a political solution that needs to be done with President Putin. But the mere idea that the Syrians are today accepting the idea that a military council, something similar to what happened in Egypt, would be there to take the reins and to secure the state, however difficult that is, I think is very telling today. Thank you, Charles.
Rime, thank you so much. Over to you, Robert.
Thank you, Charles, and thank you for inviting me today. And it's very nice to be here with Carmit and with Itamar, and also it's very nice to meet Rime for the first time. I want to talk a little bit about the book, which I think has some particular analyses which I have not seen elsewhere, and which recommend it to people who are really interested in understanding the conflict in Syria now. Two things really stood out to me in the book, which I think really, Itamar and Carmit, you deserve a lot of praise for this. First, your assessment of what's going on inside Syria is, I think, one of the best we have seen in the last year or two. It has a lot of detail with names, and I think that's useful. There's a certain level of detail we just don't see elsewhere. And second, I was just fascinated by your description of the Israel, Russia, Iran triangle. And I think this is not something which we get to discuss in the United States very much with Israeli experts. And so I hope during the discussion today, we'll get to talk about that a little bit. And I want to pose a question now that I hope will sort of spur discussion. You described in your book the Israeli national security interest of not allowing Iran to deeply embed itself in Syria, and in particular, to provide new sophisticated missile systems. And you mentioned the airstrikes, which the Israelis have been conducting for years now against Iranian targets. And your book, you describe a little bit of a Russian policy which adapts. On the one hand, sort of accepted it, but at the same time, you mentioned at times the Russians have helped the Syrian air defense systems. And I think this is a kind of an ongoing issue, which I hope you'll have time to discuss today. I would be in particular interested in your assessments of Russian red lines and Israeli red lines, and whether or not there is a potential for greater collaboration between Jerusalem and Moscow going forward, and where does that leave Iran? In other words, do you think Russia and Israel can compel Iran eventually to depart from Syria? It's very obvious the Americans can't force the Iranians to depart from Syria, but the Israelis, unlike the Americans, are conducting regular military operations against the Iranians. So I'm going to stop there, and I would just love to start the conversation there. We just don't get to hear Israeli experts talk about this very much.
Yeah, Robert, thank you so much. You sort of took my role for a minute in that that was precisely what I was keen on following up with at the beginning. to go back first to the ambassador and to Carmit. So let me just kind of add to Robert's kind of comments and questions with what I was going to say, which I think tags along quite well. In my discussions with Israeli officials, both on the MFA side, but also on the kind of defense and intelligence side, I've often heard, or I did often hear, the phrase, "the better the devil we know," a few years ago, when we saw Israeli policy on Syria pivot somewhat to accept the fall of the South to the regime on the basis of a variety of sort of guarantees that Russia had offered, and principally guarantees surrounding Iran's status in Syria. So I was going to ask, in conjunction with Robert's comments, with hindsight, we're now in 2021, was that pivot a wise pivot? Was it a mistake? Do we not know yet? And to what extent are lessons being learnt in Israel about Russia's capacity to pull through on the guarantees that it may or may not have been making at the time?
Okay, let me begin with that. Let me first spend a brief moment on the term "the devil we know," which was, I think, coined by Prime Minister Sharon in a conversation with President George W. Bush, who was very cross with Assad and said something like, let's together get rid of him. And Assad said, better the devil we know. In other words, what he meant was, if the alternative to Assad is an Islamist or a jihadi regime, then we are better off with Assad. And that was part of the dilemma that Israel faced once a civil war broke out in Syria and the Syrian state, in a way, collapsed. And no state can be indifferent to events like this that happen on its border, particularly at a time when ISIS seemed to reign supreme, and there was a danger that the ISIS would threaten Jordan and would really bring about a radical change in the region. But I think ultimately the axis Iran, Syria, Hezbollah is more dangerous to Israel than a jihadi threat. Now, with regard to your question and to Ambassador Ford's question on Israel, Russia, Iran, we are a country of 8 million people. We are not a match for Russia. I mean, and traditionally, we, in our working or alliance with the United States, the notion was, we can deal with our neighbors, but you have to deal with the Soviets at the time, or with Russia now. Russia is not interested in a direct conflict with Israel, but it has its own red lines, which are mainly the preservation of the regime and its own assets in Syria. It is, I think, ambivalent with regard to Iran, which is partly a partner and partly a competitor. And it can live with Israeli attacks on Iran as long as Israel doesn't hit regime targets, or of course Russian targets. But to the question of lining up or aligning with Russia in order to get Iran out of Syria, I think that belongs to a larger political table where the United States needs to sit as well. One did speak at the time about the grand bargain between the United States and Russia that would involve a solution to the Syrian problem, not just getting rid of Iran, but helping to solve the issue in return for concessions to Russia elsewhere. That's not a game in which we can be a very important player. But I'm sure Carmit may have something to add as well.
Sure. With regard to the Israeli strategy in Syria, it is true. I mean, until 2016, Israel hardly interfered in what happened there. Israel basically accepted that Bashar al-Assad was in power, and it preferred the devil we know. At that time, as Itamar mentioned, the world felt that it was either Assad or ISIS. Israel also assumed that Assad is mostly concerned with regaining his hold over Syria. He's not interested in a direct confrontation with Israel. So in a way, it served its security interests to accept the fact that Assad is still in power. And I think that it took a while before Israel woke up and saw that Iran and its proxies were exploiting the opportunity and the chaos in the country in order to reinforce their influence and presence, as we all know, by developing their military capabilities, rockets, missiles, and so on. So with regard to the devil we know approach, I think that lately there is a debate in Israel arguing that from a strategic and also moral perspective, it would be better off without Assad. Again, there are certain circles who believe in this idea in Israel, not everyone here. And I think that as Israel realized that Assad is either unwilling or unable to remove the Iranian presence from Syria, and that eventually is an integral part of the radical axis. So as I said, there is a debate in Israel, and since then, as we've been seeing in the past few months, Israel increased its aerial campaigns against Iranian assets in Syria. With regard to this triangle, yes, it's a fascinating topic, the relation between Russia and Israel, and of course the issue of Iran. I think that Israel and Russia managed to gain or to maintain a good relationship, a strategic coordination, and a useful mechanism to avoid direct clashes between them or misunderstandings. And I think that it would be interesting to point out that from Moscow's perspective, you know, a lot of people tend to think that the relations between Russia and Iran are harmonious. And there are some tension, especially now. There are a great deal of competition between them. I think Iran in Syria is a partner in Russian perspective, whose interests are overlap, but are not identical with its own. And I think that the Russians realized that once that Assad had won the war, its reliance on Iran's boots on the ground declined. Moscow became, as we all know, increasingly uneasy with the Iranian vision to entrench itself in Syria. And it also, of course, its main goal right now is to seek stabilization in Syria. And in that manner, I think that, again, in Russian perspective, the Iran is more of a burden rather than an asset with regard to some specific issues. I think that another source of tension between them is Russia's desire to maintain proper relations with Israel. And we all remember that the meeting between US members and Israeli and Russian, and Russia promised US and Israel to remove the Iranian presence from the border to a distance of 80 kilometers. And Iran is putting a hard time on Russia to fulfill this commitment. So there are a lot of tensions between them, also in the economic aspect, but we can address this issue later.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Let me turn over to a slightly different tack, even slightly zooming up in the air, slightly bigger picture, a question to all four of you. And I wonder if maybe you could each take a few minutes to address some or all of what I pose. The book, I think in the conclusion, says that there have basically been 7 interrelated factors that contributed towards Assad's either survival or victory, depending on how you define it. And I'll list them just briefly for the audience. Assad's ruthlessness was 1. The divisions within the opposition was 2. The emergence of ISIS and the distraction that presented to the international community. Russia and Iran's consistent support to the regime. The ineffectiveness of the opposition's international backers. Consecutive reluctance from both Obama and Trump administrations to get more deeply involved. And then finally, the international community's failure to pursue what you termed a Yugoslavia-style humanitarian intervention. So you, I think, quite aptly summed up those 7 factors as being the main contributing reason for why we are where we are today. So I guess the first part of my question to all of you would be, so with hindsight, 10 years on, and I expect all of you will come at this from a different angle, should more have been done? Should less have been done? And if so, in what way? And then the second part of the question, from someone sat in Washington, D.C. today, there is an ongoing, fairly intense debate about whether or not Syria still matters in foreign policy writ large, and then secondarily, if it does, what should we be doing in and around Syria? So where do you all stand from your own respective perspectives, where you are sat, where you live, and with all of your experiences, where do you stand on that debate? So two interrelated questions. And why don't we start with the respondents first this time to give our authors some time to think through. So we'll start with you, Rime, if that's okay, and then Ambassador Ford.
These are big questions, and I personally have written a lot about what should have been done. Yes, a lot more could have been done, especially during the early years of the Syrian revolution, which then turned into a war. At the point before Russia intervened, when Iran was encroaching into Syria even more than it had before the revolution, by the way. Since the advent of Bashar Assad's regime, the Iranians have been very slowly infiltrating every level of society and all over Syria geographically. Before the intervention of Russia and before the chemical massacre of August 2013, a lot could have been done. Bashar Assad at that time was unable to manage the uprising all over the country. That's why he needed the militias. But I'd like to focus more, if you don't mind, Charles, on what could we still do and does it matter? I think it matters immensely. And the mere fact that we have these millions of refugees, which Assad does not want back in Syria. I mean, you know, they talk the talk, but in the end, the Assad cronies have not been shy about explaining that it's much easier to control a country where half the population has gone than to get back to what it was before. There is no reconstruction that will be done as long as Assad is in power. The only construction and not reconstruction is luxury projects done by the cronies to appeal once more to the certain class of people who think that this will get them back on track. The refugees, which now number around 6 million in the area, and the internally displaced people, which number around 7 million, but nobody knows for sure. Let's say 12, 13 million Syrians. These have been refugees for nearly 10 years. Not all of them at once, but a lot of them were born in the camps or in the neighboring countries, even if not in official camps. They are stuck in an infernal circle where there's no education, there's no help, there's no prospect. These people are getting radicalized. These people are marrying one another without being literate, and they're bringing up a new generation of refugees. So we shouldn't just consider the actual number of refugees right now, but if we consider how fast the last 10 years have gone, can you imagine what would happen in 10 years when that number has doubled, when they are more illiterate than their parents, and when the Assad regime and Iran, which has not been yet tackled, because the Russians have a very different goal and outlook for Syria. But Iran functions with the concept of wilayat al-faqih. They need this entire region to be under their control. And it ties everything in the region together. It ties Iraq for obvious reasons, but also Lebanon. And I wouldn't even refer to Hezbollah as a militia anymore. I consider it, for all intents and purposes, a regime which is holding Lebanon and Syria partly hostage. So what happens, and does Syria matter? It matters, and it will matter to the Europeans. And one of the subjects I bring up often is that this now is the time for the EU and the US, especially under the new administration, to reconsider all the steps that it can take and to act as a joint or united front, not just to deal with the Iranians, but also with Russia.
Thank you, Rime. Ambassador Ford.
the list that you mentioned, Charles, from Itamar and Carmit's book is something we all should talk about a bit. I'm just going to take one little piece, one of those factors, which was the international community's reluctance. And you drew the parallel to the Balkans. So let me address that a bit. I actually, in my class for undergraduates here at Yale University, we talk quite a bit about the Dayton Accord and look at it. It would have been very difficult to replicate the Balkans recipe in Syria. Here are just a couple of reasons why. There was no single clear opposition leader who could deliver agreement from all of the key armed factions. By contrast, Izetbegovic, although he had some issues within his Bosnia-Herzegovinian government, he and his government could deliver. We didn't have a partner quite like that on the Syrian opposition side. We can go into why, but second, and I think this is extremely important, Russia was quite weak when the Americans intervened in the Balkans. Boris Yeltsin took over after the Soviet Union came apart. Vladimir Putin is not in the same position now with respect to foreign policy generally and with respect to Syria. We even had a Russian unit integrated into a NATO command in the Balkans. Can anyone imagine that Vladimir Putin would put a Russian unit under the command of the American forces in eastern Syria? I think it's unimaginable. And finally, and maybe this is the most important point, a leader like the Serbian Milosevic in Belgrade did not perceive that a Bosnia-Herzegovinian state, which even encompassed some Serbian territories, some Bosnian Serbian territories, he didn't perceive it as being essential or as a critical threat. Sorry, he did not perceive that as a critical threat to his own survival. In fact, he was right. He went on for years. If we made one mistake in the West, I think, we assumed that if we piled on pressure on Assad, he would eventually come to the negotiating table. And I think this is a question which is not clear. I don't think there's a clear answer to this. I'd be very interested in the other panelists' thoughts on this. But Assad, as the book mentions, as Itamar and Carmit mentioned, he was quite ruthless and not prepared to negotiate. In that sense, we may have dangerously underestimated him. So I'm going to stop there.
Robert, thank you so much. Ambassador Rabinovich?
Yeah. So first, with regard to the past, I doubt that a Yugoslavia-like solution would have applied. I think Assad had to be defeated. Let us recall that in 2015, what actually prompted the Russian willingness to come in was the prospect of a military defeat. It was not that far. And I want to go back to 2012, to the Petraeus plan as head of the CIA, together with several international and regional partners to really train and arm the Free Syrian Army as a match to the Syrian army and try to win the war. May or may not have worked, but it was supported by Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and vetoed by President Obama. With regard to the current debate, I agree with you yourself published a very interesting paper for Syria Matters on this debate. I fully agree with it. The fact is that the Syrian crisis right now doesn't seem to threaten anyone in particular, but there are about 5 or 6 ticking time bombs. Idlib, the refugees, the Israeli-Iranian conflict, and so forth, and it could easily go back to becoming a major bleeding regional and international conflict and better be dealt with. I would like, we are not here to, here Israelis are not here to give advice to the United States. We're not happy with the idea of pivoting away from the region. We'd like to see the United States in the region and playing a role in the Syrian crisis. I think that the policy pursued not so much by Trump, but by his bureaucracy, Ambassador Jeffrey and others, say of continuing to apply pressure through sanctions and denial of financial aid for reconstruction until Assad is defeated or until the Iranians or the Russians lose interest and patience, may be the best recipe for continuing forward.
Carmit?
I agree that the US policy towards Syria had a significant impact on the course of events there. And more specifically, the crucial American decision with regard to this conflict were made by President Obama in 2012 and 2013, when he overruled the plan to arm and train the Free Syrian Army, and also when he decided, of course, to ignore his own red line and refrain from penalizing Assad for massive use of chemical weapons against his own people. That was to be one of the most important turning points of the Syrian crisis. And that was the move who paved the way, among others, for Russia's military intervention, and also inflicted a deadly blow on the Syrian opposition. So I would say that was the main turning point with regard to the American intervention. With regard to the new administration, of course, they still seem to be debating the right way to approach the Syrian issue. But I think that this administration should act more assertively in the diplomatic, in the humanitarian, and also in the economic aspect with regard to this conflict, starting with boosting the diplomatic process within the framework of the US Resolution 2054. And also in the humanitarian realm, I think that US has to secure humanitarian assistance to refugees and to Syrians living in areas not controlled by the regime, especially now with Russia's plan to veto any extension to cross-border aid access into Syria. The new administration, and this is something that, again, we've learned our lessons. I think that the new administration must commit itself to punishing militarily any renewed campaign of mass killing of civilians in Syria. So I think eventually that, Syria is too important to be ignored. And it definitely matters. There are a lot of, I think that the US still has leverage in order to influence and change the course of events there.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Time's ticking along at a relatively quick pace here, so let me try and see if we can do kind of like a lightning round where I'll throw out 3 questions that I've had from the audience, and I should note we've got many others, and you can all pick perhaps one of them at your leisure to respond in relatively short order, if that's all right. The first question is, I'll be summarizing these. Iran plays a dominant role in Syria. If Syria isn't on the agenda of America's likely talks with Iran on the nuclear file, what hope will Syria have for change or accountability? Another question is, how does Israel view Turkey's role in Syria, particularly given Turkey's occasional hostile posture towards Iran and Iranian-backed militias? And another question is an interesting one, citing the Syrian philosopher Yassin Haj Saleh, who recently said that Syria's Holocaust isn't the mass death and destruction in the country, but it's the survival of the genocidal state and the deprivation of any hope. I just wondered if I could get you your kind of comments on what that means. Is that accurate, and what are the implications of that? So those are 3 pretty big questions, but please feel free to pick any of them. And why don't we go in the same order as we went just now? So we'll start with you, Rime.
This is the golden opportunity for the United States to take the chance that it's being offered with the renewal of the nuclear deal, with the talks beginning, to put some conditions on Iran. All is not lost. We are in a completely different situation today. We do have some indication that the Biden administration is not exactly placing Syria as its priority, which is very short-sighted. We have a lot of regulars from the Obama administration who are now at the White House at Foggy Bottom as well. But this is really the golden opportunity to reconsider what quid pro quo, to use that famous word, famous expression we've seen in the US recently, what Iran needs to do in order for the US to come back to the nuclear deal. The mistake was already done the first time it was signed. This is the time to impose some very strong measures on Iran. And if that doesn't happen this time, then I would say all is lost. As what Yassin Haj Saleh has said, he is absolutely right. And this is what I was referring to in my previous comments, that if we think the situation is bad today, we yet have not considered all the repercussions of starting now, with the refugees, with Syria being completely destroyed, with no reconstruction coming, because if there's one thing the Europeans are adamant about, it is that no reconstruction money will come until serious change is done. I would advise the international community to completely withdraw its support for the Constitutional Committee unless something serious is done, and stop giving this false blanket of respectability to this process, which means nothing.
Great, thanks, Rime. Ambassador Ford.
They're all good questions. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Iran question also. I hear a lot of talk when people raise Syria about the need for more diplomacy and stronger diplomacy. And it sounds great, but what does it mean exactly? I think it's pretty clear now that the Iranians are not going to surrender to American diktats. Are they weaker? Of course they are. But it doesn't mean that they're prepared to surrender. And so when we talk about the Iranian role in Syria and engaging on it, ultimately, Itamar and Carmit were just saying that the Russians are not going to deliver Iranian withdrawal. There may be a tacit agreement between Moscow and Jerusalem about limiting Iranian influence, but that's different from eliminating it totally. In fact, I would be interested in what Carmit and Itamar think, but my guess is the Russians are not really anxious for the Iranians to completely withdraw from Syria, because that would almost certainly require the Russians to put in more resources to hold the Assad government together, to keep it in control of the cities in Western Syria. So as we think about the Americans engaging about Syria with Iran, a question which we have to ask, and which no one in Washington is asking, is what are we prepared to offer the Iranians? I mean, we know what we want, but what are we prepared to offer them in return? Similar question actually can be applied with respect to talking to the Russians about Syria. The Russians, of course, want help, financial help for the Syrian government. But I haven't heard anyone in Washington actually thinking about a sort of a hierarchy of US national interests in Syria and what we are prepared to relinquish in order to get what we really must have. And I think that's a debate we can absolutely consult with our friends in Jerusalem and our friends in Europe. But that is a debate that we need to have in Washington as we think about what to do with Iran in Syria. Obviously, we have interest with respect to the Iranians in Syria, but I don't know that they're as big as our interests in terms of preventing Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. And that also is a debate that we need to have in Washington. I'll stop there.
Ambassador Rabinovich.
Yeah. So in the current preparation for negotiations between the United States and Iran, there are three different issues: the nuclear issue, the regional issue, and the missiles issue. I very much hope that the Biden administration will show resilience and creativity and so forth in dealing with the most important issue, which is the nuclear. I doubt that it will have much muscle left for the other two issues. In the regional issue, Syria is going to be the toughest because for the Iranians, Syria and Lebanon, which go together, are the most important regional possession and achievement. They're not likely to be very flexible. On Turkey in theory could be the response, the regional response to Iran is about the same size. It's comparable in resources and strength. But Erdogan does play that role. I mean, there is a certain rivalry, but there's also cooperation. I doubt that we can rely on Erdogan to be the counterpart to Iran. And finally, with regard to Yassin Khasaleh, the context is, let's call it the context of the Arab Spring, the general sense of unhappiness of a large part of the Arab population with the state of affairs in the Arab world. And he's right in the sense that if Assad and his gang remain in power, this is like a bucket of ice water thrown in the face of many Arabs.
And Carmit?
Yes, so with regard to the agreement, I think that for Israel, the nuclear issue is a top priority over other issues, including the regional activity, and therefore including them in the negotiation with Iran could cancel the ability to quickly reach agreements in the nuclear and could lead to deal with them at the expense of the nuclear issue. And more specifically with regard to the Iranian entrenchment in Syria, I can offer the Israeli perspective or some recommendation, if I may, to Israel on how to cope with this threat. First of all, I think that this is something that has been done in the past few months, and Israel is increasing its aerial campaigns against Iranian assets in Syria. And now it's a good opportunity because I think that the Iranian Shiite axis is weakened. So this is the right time to exploit this weakness and to step up aerial attacks. But it's not enough to act militarily. It's neither for Israel nor the US or other actors in the Syrian conflict, as we've learned. I think that Israel should also act at the humanitarian level and must strengthen its relations with local population who oppose the regime and by that oppose the Iranians, including Sunnis, Druze, Kurds, and grant them some humanitarian aids, including food, fuel, health services, and so forth, because the equation is quite simple. It's either us or the Iranians, and I think that Israel should do more on this matter. And finally, at the diplomatic level, I think that Israel must support and encourage an international political initiative to remove Assad from power, from the country. That, of course, will require a tighter cooperation between Russia and the United States, while taking into account their shared interests with Turkey and, of course, with the European Union backing that will end the war and bring Syria back on a track for political reforms and reconstruction. This is, in my opinion, the only way. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your quick and concise answers. I wish we had more time. I think we could definitely do another half an hour. There's certainly a lot more questions from the audience. So let me say first to the audience, thank you ever so much for your engagement. I'm sorry we couldn't get through nearly all of your questions, but please do continue to tune into MEI events, including Syria-focused events, and I'm sure we'll do our best to continue to engage with you. But to our panelists, thank you so much for joining us. Ambassador Rabinovich, Carmit, Valensi, congratulations on a fantastic book. Thank you so much for reaching out to MEI. We're thrilled to have hosted this event, and we look forward to continuing our engagement with you. And yeah, again, thank you ever so much to all of you for your fantastic and insightful comments. And for now, goodbye.